Yeah, we should begin.
I'm ready.
Are you ready, John?
Yeah, can you hear this? Working
Not-
good. Tonight for a workshop, the regular meeting will begin at 7:30. We usually do a training session from 7 to 7:30, and tonight we're going to talk about traffic calming issues on Main Street. This is part of the Access Committee's work. And they're preparing a sort of a summary report of all the recommendations now, and we're fighting through this section on speeding and traffic calming. And it's the last section in the report. So back in 2019, there was a study done, a 2-day session sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration on pedestrian safety. And they brought in a team of consultants to go up and down Main Street and make sort of interim recommendations. And this is their report, the cover. You can see no crosswalks at the intersection. This is at Walnut at that time. This is before the pandemic, so it provides good ammunition, because since the pandemic, we haven't been able to do hardly any sort of inventory work because things are so disruptive in terms of the parklets and everything else. One of the things they did was they looked at traffic data, accident reports for the previous 10 years. And so these maps going from Walcott on this end over to Churchill on this end shows the pedestrian accidents in yellow and the bicycle crashes in green, which is not a remarkable number for a 10-year period, but you can see how they cluster around Willow and Cedar and Walnut and especially Teller. I think what's most surprising about this, what's most surprising to me, is I always thought that this area around Churchill Street was probably the most dangerous part of Main Street. Everybody always thinks that because it's on a curve and it's got this weird angled intersection. No accidents there reported. Out of those accidents, 73% were at intersections. So it's not, the bulk of them are sort of turning incidents, in particular left turns. Almost all of them were left turn pedestrian crashes, or crashes involving pedestrians. And the other major contributor, but it was a minority amount, was people walking out between in parked cars. So you can see the traffic volumes on Main Street are relatively low. People always complain about parking and traffic congestion, and those are the complaints that the Main Street Access Committee tends to hear. Speeding, but if you look at the numbers are relatively low for Main Street. In fact, it's too low for sort of a business district. Generally speaking, you want to have a certain amount of traffic. It helps slow cars, number one, and you want a lot of passersby looking at your storefronts if you're in business. So the number here is, the peak number in 2019 was 6774. And just by comparison, Fishkill has over 15,000 cars at annual average daily traffic, and Wappingers Falls has 13,000 plus.
I find that a little bit unusual because when I am on Main Street during the weekends, it does seem very congested. People seem to get very impatient. I've had people yell at me because I was stopping to parallel park.
Yeah.
Had a guy roll down his window and tell me I was on a thoroughfare and I needed to keep moving. Couldn't pull into a space. You know, I see people. One of the things I see on Main Street that scares me is people getting frantic to get to a space. They see a space, they're racing towards it, or they're doing a U-turn to get to it, either on Tioronda or Main Street. It's that kind of like, you know, bad decisions driven by hurry up and find the parking spot.
Yeah. So
Are we so low during the work week that that's what's creating that
well,
average?
usually the average daily is measured on a work day.
Yeah, because during the week, it can be a ghost town, but on the
Yeah.
weekends, it's dangerous and congested.
Right. Well, we also looked at all the accumulated traffic studies that were done before the pandemic for the 5 years between the pandemic and in the 5 years before that, to see level of service issues, to see if there were backed up. And many of those look at Saturday as well as a peak hour on Saturday as well as peak hour on typical weekday. And what they found almost across the board, actually across the board, was the level of service on Main Street was A and B, almost nothing in terms of delay. And generally speaking, you don't want to see, it's not recommended to have A and B level of service on Main Street because that just means people are cruising on through rather than being held up and saying, oh, that's a new store, maybe I'll go to that restaurant tonight or whatever. You want a certain amount of congestion in order to slow people down, especially on our Main Street, because there's very few reasons to stop if it's not congested. There's only 2 lights on Main Street, 3 if you count the dummy light, and no stop signs. So once you get around the corner across there, you can cruise on through as if you hit the light. And like you say, people tend to speed up at lights rather than slow down because they want to beat if it's green, they want to make sure they get through before it turns red. The only level of service C on Main Street was westbound at Walcott. So it's getting off Main Street at the Route 9D. And the only measured one that I found at level of service D was Tioronda at Saturday peak hour, trying to get out onto Main Street.
It's a very difficult place to see down Main Street when you're turning from Tioronda out onto Main Street because of the parked cars.
Yes. So,
John, what do the levels mean? A, B, C, D?
well, it's A through F. A means there's hardly any delay at an intersection, less than 10 seconds. And F means it's a long delay, maybe 2 cycles of light or over 80 seconds worth of delay at a traffic signal. That's sort of the general. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Stark.
No, yeah, that's all correct.
So at any rate, at least from the measurements, there's not a capacity problem. There's not too much volumes on Main Street. There's not too much delays on Main Street, except in extraordinary peak hours, which are on weekends and when it's tourist time, rather than from average daily residential and business type traffic. But there is an issue with speed. We've seen that. There are accidents. Out of those 30 accidents over the 10-year, 2 were serious injury, and then we just had a fatality here on Main Street. So that's, gets everybody's attention, and you want to try to deal with speed and safety, even if there aren't capacity volumes or peak problems that are extraordinary.
The other issue I've noticed is that on the weekends, because what's Main Street speed limit? Is it 30? It's 30 miles per hour. So when you're on a bicycle, there's not enough room in the lane for you, and cars want to speed around you because generally, you could almost keep up. You could almost keep up with the speed of traffic if the speed limit was slowed down a little bit, and it wouldn't be such an issue where people would be trying to pass you all the time. There's not enough really room between parked cars and the traffic lanes for bicyclists to be being passed constantly by cars. And so as a result, I try not to bike on Main Street on the weekends after 10 or 11 a.m. It's basically it.
So speed is an issue. And you can see by the graph at the top or the chart at the top, it makes a really big difference in terms of pedestrian injuries and deaths. So if you're hit by a car at 20 miles an hour, a typical car, higher if it's an SUV than if it's a sedan, but on average, 10% of people die in 20 mile an hour crashes. And it goes up to 40% at 30 miles an hour and 80% at 40 miles an hour. So there's a real incentive to keep people driving slowly. I just went from Bank Square to Fountain Square And it takes less than 4 minutes to go the whole length of Main Street. And yet people have to speed. I don't know why. They're not gaining any significant amount. That's it going at 20 miles an hour, 4 minutes. So it's not like you're gaining 10 minutes by going faster.
Right.
It's impossible. So around the country, many cities are looking at a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit under the banner 20 is plenty. And Portland, Oregon, Norfolk, Virginia, Denver, a slew of cities are lowering their speed limits, especially in business districts. So that's one of the recommendations of the Access Committee, is to take it down from what it is currently now, 25 to 20, and to put up signs so people know that it's 20. Another way of dealing with traffic calming is to narrow the lanes. Now, Beacon has relatively narrow lanes already, but it's inconsistently narrow. So in some cases, like this block, which I show at the top, at Rite Aid there, it's 9 feet 2, which is really too narrow, you know, and so there's a lot of complaints about clipped mirrors in those really narrow sections. And then in other areas, it's up to 11 feet or close to 11 feet, which is too wide. So what they've done is they've uniformly striped 8-foot parking spaces on both sides. So the lanes get narrower and wider, but the parking lane stays the same. And what we've suggested is to do the exact opposite, to set a narrow, consistent lane for Main Street that's not too wide but not too narrow. And we picked the number 10'2". And then you vary the width of the parking lanes in order to make that consistent lane width. So another traffic calming thing is put something in the middle, you know. But on a narrow lane, you can't really do that. You can't put bike lanes in. You can't put in chicanes or other sorts of deviations to try to slow people down. You do have the dummy light on East Main Street. That's a great calming influence, or could be, except that intersection is extraordinarily wide. And so, you know, it's 46 feet from across where that crosswalk should be. There's no crosswalk there, but it's 46 feet across, an extra 10 or 15 feet over what you really want. So one of the recommendations is to redesign East Main Street intersection completely and put in big curb extensions and a crosswalk across there, and to make this a three-way stoplight. So the light would blink red in all directions, and everybody would come up, establish eye contact with pedestrians, with motorists at the other edge, and then proceed. So that you wouldn't have people trying to dart out between, you know, people in the street jaywalking or crossing at what should be a crosswalk. So there's a whole design in the report on how this should be redesigned.
Is there any talk of getting rid of the dummy light?
No.
Good.
There's only 2 of them in the entire state of New York. It's a historic landmark, and
I heard in the country.
I've seen the one up in Canajoharie or wherever it is. I think it's only in New York State there's 2 of them. There's probably more. Another way is curb extensions. Now the city is in the process of finishing up that project, and hopefully when it's paved, it'll look a lot better than the way it is. But you can see on the top, that's a favorite place for trucks to park during delivery, is in the no parking zones at the intersections where the stripes are. And so the curb extensions eliminate that real blockage of visibility of pedestrians and cars coming out from side streets. The curb extensions will prevent that from happening. It'll shorten up the crosswalks, it'll reduce speeds. Anything that creates a sense of side friction. That's what traffic calming is really about. It's about unconsciously slowing people down because there's enough feeling of tightness and threat that they naturally slow down. So you can put all the speed limits up you want, because enforcement is never going to be perfect. It's never going to be close to perfect, it seems. But if you do certain traffic calming action, it naturally slows people down to where they abide by the speed limit without knowing it.
This is a little bit off that topic, but I wanted to point out that those, along Main Street, there are several intersections where there are, that middle picture, the one-way sign, the one-way arrow sign to
Yep.
the left is mounted on 2 poles,
Yeah,
and it's like right in the path of pedestrians if they're going straight and not taking that angled crosswalk. And there are several, it seems like an unnecessary obstacle, plus the sign is low. So somebody could just walk right into it. And I'm wondering why it was designed that way.
I can't say that for sure,
Do you
one
know?
way or the other, but the point being is that the crosswalks will be relocated when they're restriped, so that they won't be where that sign is.
No, but the sign is placed still so that, I mean, it's
Yeah.
like right in the path of pedestrian traffic. It's like, as a pedestrian, it strikes me, as just somebody put it there who's totally who just like doesn't walk.
Yeah. Well, there has to be, one-way signs are sort of a real critical safety sign, and I think they have
Yeah,
to be
for sure.
within so many feet of the intersection.
Yeah.
I see if it was 3 feet to the left, it would probably be better for everybody. So I didn't have any signs of what this will look like once they put in the, but I picked up a slide from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, so you can see how curb extensions shorten the crosswalks and create a sort of real high visibility for pedestrians at corners. And the bold, what's called continental crosswalks, sort of Abbey Road stripes, provide the best way of marking crosswalks that also prevent cars from picking up the paint too easily, because they have parallel spaces for the tires to go. Street trees and on-street parking are also considered traffic calming. Anything that gives you a sense of enclosure. So taller buildings are a traffic calming device if they're close enough to the sidewalks. Certainly street trees, on-street parking definitely. So anything that gives that side friction will help naturally slow people down. Not everybody, not 100%, but the vast majority of people drive slower when there's a sense of narrowness about the street.
What about those like small, I wouldn't really call them bollards, but they're basically little stick-ups that are often like in the center of a pedestrian walkway
Yeah.
that have a sign on them saying, it's an admonition that you have to yield to pedestrians.
Yeah, generally those are put where the traffic calming measures, the
Yeah.
street's designed poorly, so you put up a sign to try to correct it.
Okay.
Like
Because
in
they're,
Wappingers Falls, the lanes are really wide, or in Village of Fishkill, the lanes are too wide, and so they put those things in the middle to try to slow people down because they naturally want to go fast because the lanes are wide. In Beacon, there's no room for those, which is a good thing. They tried them and they kept getting knocked over.
okay.
Usually, like DPW does not. DPW's like don't like them. I think in Albany they don't allow them
Yeah.
because they just get run over.
They're real maintenance issues. Now,
Yeah.
another thing that the committee is considering, and these are the sort of tougher choices that are obviously not going to be left up to the access committee. They're going to be part of the city council and public discussion. But you can slow people down with raised crosswalks or mid-block crosswalks, or even raised intersections in which you ramp up slowly. They're not like a speed bump. They're a very shallow ramp coming into them. You bring up the intersection to the level of the curb, so instead of pedestrians have to ramp down, wheelchair users having to ramp down to the street, the cars ramp up to the intersection. And at the corners, you have bollards to protect the corners, but it's a straight walk across, which gives everybody less trip hazards for pedestrians. And cars got motors. They can get up those ramps easy enough, but it does give enough of a textural and grade change that you feel it. And so when you come to that intersection, instead of having a traffic light, which encourages you to speed and encourages you to look up while you speed rather than look for pedestrians, because you're looking at the light to see if it's going to turn yellow and whether you have to hit on your brakes. So you're looking at the light as opposed to looking at the pedestrian crosswalk. The raised intersections, the raised crosswalks provide that slowdown without distracting people's attention. They're actually focused on the ramp coming up and the striping rather than looking somewhere else.
Which cities has that been implemented in, do you know?
The one on the bottom is a proposal for Lark Street in Albany. I'm not familiar with Lark Street, but I pulled it offline. There's a lot of raised crosswalks in the country, not as many raised intersections, because they're more expensive. But if the city wanted to do them, now would be the time to do them, because they just stuck in all those ramps up the curb extensions, so they probably wouldn't. But for instance, the committee recommended a mid-block crosswalk near the Beacon Theater, where that intersection is with the parking lot on Van Nydak, because that's a long block, and people build up speed there because the lanes are a little wider there. So you could have a mid-block crosswalk there at that intersection with the access to the parking lot in the rear. And then there's always the stop signs. The committee recommended stop signs on all corners within 2 blocks of Main Street. There's sort of a hit and miss pattern on the side streets around Main Street. So some are 2-way, some are 4-way, and it's very confusing. Some people blow by them, and others are expecting people to stop. It's kind of dangerous. So the easiest way to deal with it is make them all stop signs. There were even several intersections where there was no stop sign at Main Street, which made no sense. So at Willow Street and Skank, there were no stop signs. So people would be able to sort of cruise right in. So we recommended stop signs at any intersection street with Main Street. And then throwing out a consideration of having a stop sign or 2 along Main Street in the straightaways. So at, say, Elm Street or Willow Street, before people could build up a head of steam coming around those corners and out towards the light. Put a stop sign in, an all-way stop sign, maybe at Willow where people have a hard time coming out. It's a 2-way street where there's traffic actually coming on to Main Street as opposed to going away from it. You could have a 3-way stop there, and that would slow people down and build up that momentum. There's a big debate about stop signs as whether they're appropriate as a traffic calming measure, because people don't always stop at them, they sort of roll through them. But even rolling through them is better than blowing through when there's no stop sign. And then the final suggestion was...
Oh, sorry, can I just make a quick comment about stop signs at intersections? A place where I feel vulnerable as a pedestrian is when when the street is going the same direction on either side of Main Street, and I have to cross, I think it's like Elm Street, I think is like that. So I have to cross Elm Street, and if there's a break in Main Street traffic, somebody trying to cross is just going to zip across really fast and not necessarily see the pedestrian in the crosswalk,
Yeah.
especially when they're trying to get to that gas station. So
It's true. So there might be a couple side streets in which an all-way stop sign might be appropriate to allow side traffic to come in. So people, like Willow is a 2-way street. There are very few 2-way intersections with Main Street. Tioronda is another one. Skank is another one. So they're just throwing that out as consideration. And then finally, the last one is leading pedestrian intervals. That's a technique where you give the pedestrians a head start, something like 3 to 4 or 5, 6 seconds before the light turns green, so that the pedestrians have a chance to get past the first lane and get out there where people can see them to avoid the left turners. That's recommended for Teller, certainly, and maybe for Chestnut as well, where there are traffic signals. The idea, you could also replace Chestnut with a all-way stop sign, which, again, people with traffic lights, there's too many accidents at traffic lights where people blow through them. They either speed through them or they miss them because they're looking somewhere else at a storefront or something, and then you have serious issues. So those are sort of the things on the table. None of this has been decided. This is just sort of a draft reporting stage at this point. All of these have been interim recommendations to the council and will be incorporated into the summary report of suggestions. And again, fully vetted with the public before anything's decided.
Just to weigh in, there's a good resource, the FHWA. If you just Google traffic calming primer, there's a good website that comes up that has multiple modules, but one that's very helpful is a toolbox that kind of lists other traffic calming measures and gives you kind of engineering metrics for them, as well as some case studies and examples. So,
FHWA?
yep, the FHWA, Federal Highway Administration.
Yeah, the only comment I'd make is that if you, if you've experienced other more urban and older environments, a lot of them that don't have a lot of highway, automobile architecture, the automobile-centered signage, lights that are more pedestrian-oriented, even though they allow automobiles, are naturally safer because, like that, the curve at Churchill, people's attentions are more focused when they're in situations where there aren't highway scale or high-speed automobile-oriented things like signage and lights, like you were saying. So one of the things you might want to think about is focusing on the pedestrian experience as opposed to the automotive signage and lighting and all that, which also tends to put people in a frame of mind that they're in a pedestrian environment with a car rather than an automotive environment that pedestrians are unsafely also in.
Yeah, I think the raised intersection is the best example of that, where
Right.
you create sort of a pedestrian priority place, and the cars are allowed to go through, but they have to have a little inconvenience to do so.
So I guess it's a little bit past 7:30, so we have to move on and open our regular meeting.